alert. And that's it. 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Yeah.
The event is starting. We are live.
Yes.
Wow.
After quite a break.
According to YouTube.
A few weeks.
According to YouTube, we're live. So we'll see. We'll see if that's true. Let's hope that everyone can hear you. So hello everyone. Let's do a sound check because, as usual, I had to come in here and fiddle with some stuff and reboot some stuff to make sure stuff worked. So we'll give folks. I see someone saying we are alive, so I'm going to assume that means that you can see and hear us, blah, blah, blah. It's alive. All right, well, we are here. John, I haven't spoken to you in a few weeks.
It's been a bit.
It's been a little bit?
Last week I was in Norway.
Oh, what were you doing there?
Oh my gosh. It was a crazy week. It was one of those things where I said yes to one thing and then another thing and then another thing. Mm-hmm. So I gave 2 presentations at TDC in Trondheim. And then the next day I gave a workshop, or the next 2 days I gave a workshop in Trondheim.
Oh, nice.
And then I flew down to Oslo and did a one-day workshop there. And then that night I spoke at a meetup. And then the next morning I flew home.
Awesome.
Awesome. Yeah.
Did you retweet that we're going?
No, I didn't.
Quick.
I was too busy telling my story.
There'll be nobody here.
Oh, dear. All right, retweet with comment. Starting now.
We have started.
Just a second.
It's okay. Yeah, so Hashamko is commenting, I was going to say something. Your sound is different. Are you using a different headset or mic this week? It is.
I am using a different mic. Is it
like
okay?
It's terrible. It's like you're on a telephone.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Wait. Let me check. Selecting my audio inputs. Yeah. It is on. Oh. No speaker. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm on a condenser mic, but let me switch over to my headset.
Okay.
Stand by.
It wouldn't be the stand-up if it wasn't some type of audio, video, internet, camera lighting, random pig walking into the studio. I don't know. There's always something.
Yeah, well,
that
so
sounds like you. That's better.
I was shamed into this. I talked to James Montemagno, and he's like, "Oh, you're not using a condenser mic," and and I'm like, "Oh, let me get out my condenser mic," but I didn't tune it and test it and all that.
So can you to the lay people, can you actually, what is a condenser mic and why is it? I have one. That's a condenser mic over there. I used to use one in the other room that wasn't a studio. What is a condenser mic and why is it special?
Yeah, well, condenser mic, the idea is it's supposed to pick up. So I don't have the. Here's what it looks like. It's one of these when you see the big, radio person.
I've seen the word a condenser mic, USB condenser mic, blah blah blah. It's great, but what is it? Do you know? Is it a thing?
Yeah, it is a thing, and I kind of forget honestly how to describe it well. But the idea is, it's supposed to be there's different kinds. There's unidirectional mics and condenser mics and all that.
Right.
A condenser mic's supposed to pull in sound from a space.
Okay.
Well, some audio engineer on the chat's probably going to describe it better.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's all right. Well, I will say this headset mic, while as Brad points out is quite tinny, it still sounds more crisp. It's a higher frequency, a higher sampling rate. Whereas when you had the other mic plugged in, it just sounded flat. It literally sounded like you're on a telephone. It sounded like I was recording a bad Skype call.
That could be that I had a wrong setting on it. I bet there's something where I could go. Condenser mics are funky, because they can pick up from an entire room. Right. They're kind of more broad. Then you have to then they do stuff to prevent echoing and all that. So you have to be careful.
You broke the cardinal rule of live streaming, didn't you?
What's that?
You plugged in some new piece of hardware, didn't test it, and didn't do any tuning beforehand, and just assumed it would be fine. And now we spent 3 minutes talking about why your mic was crap.
Yeah. Well, again, you said that's part of the show.
That's true. Required. That's true. But I would like to get one show where we walk in, I just push a big red button, and we're live, and it's never. I mean, this was pretty smooth. We just had to swap your microphone out.
Yeah, and in order to do that, we really should have started an hour before.
Yeah, but of course it's 10 o'clock in the morning here, and so I just walked in to the building at 3 minutes to 10 because there's no way on earth I'm getting here at 9 o'clock in the morning. So
fortunately for me, because of the jet lag, I was up at 3:45 a.m. today.
Okay.
So
all right. Well, we've bored enough people, I think, long enough. Yeah. Do you have
I
a
do.
wonderful
I sure do.
community cornucopia of things to share with us this week, I hope.
Yes, I do.
Hey, John loves the community.
Do love community.
I am switching over to you.
Yep.
Full screen.
Tell me when it's ready.
I'm just waiting. There we go. Desktop is up.
Excellent. Okay, so I've got several here. So first of all, Shahed's doing a very cool series. So this is he's done several. This is fourth in the series. So here he's talking about protocols in ASP.NET Core, HTTPS and HTTP2. So talks about some of the, first of all, why you need HTTPS. He talks about new features with dev certs in 2.1, which I love showing that off. I have one minor quibble in here, is it says SSL. I know it's pedantic.
Oh, there, yeah.
Yeah, it's been TLS for a while, right? SSL isn't a thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, if you can force yourself to do it and change habit, you want to refer to it as HTTPS if you're talking about, obviously, HTTP secured traffic. Now, in .NET, of course, the stream is called SSL stream, saying that's just the way it is.
We're kind of stuck with it.
You can't rename it because that would break everything. So, word to the wise, do not name things after what may end up being transient protocols if you can at all avoid it, but no one has a crystal ball, so we never know these things.
Yep. So he mentions HTTPS, and then this is cool too, talking about HTTP2 in the roadmap for ASP.NET Core 2.2.
Yes, yeah, so ASP.NET Core 2.2, just to refresh people's memories, HTTP2 is supported by Kestrel in ASP.NET Core 2.2, sorry. It will not be on by default. You will have to enable it, and the reason for that is we haven't finished it yet. So it is functional, and it works quite well, but it hasn't gone through the same levels of rigor and testing that we have been able to put the HTTP 1.1 through. So folks might recall that up until ASP.NET Core 2, or was it 2.1? Geez, I can't remember now. We didn't actually certify Kestrel for edge readiness. So we didn't recommend that you ran Kestrel on the edge, like to the open internet, because we didn't have limits in place and things like that. So we do have some things in place for HTTP2, but it just hasn't gone through the same amount of bake time yet. And so we're saying, use HTTP2 behind the firewall in ASP.NET Core 2.2, and please give us the feedback on it. You will have to enable it with one line of code as like a binding configuration to turn it on. And then the plan is for ASP.NET Core 3, we will have had more time to ensure that it is ready for sort of edge use. So just wanted to remind folks of that.
Cool. All right. So here's one from Andrew Locke, and as always, a pretty meaty post from him. So this is talking about iname configure options and configure all. So talking about, now this is, a lot of time the lazy way of doing options is just reading them in. Here he's talking about strong, named instance, named options, right?
All right.
So he talks through that. And then one, honestly, I hadn't looked at, I'm scrolling quickly towards the end here, is configure all of type T. And I don't know if I've seen that before and forgotten it, but this is something I wasn't aware of.
So I think what happened is, again, this is something that has evolved since the beginning of ASP.NET Core. We didn't have named options in the first couple of versions, and then it was required for scenarios where you want to use a single subsystem like identity or the authentication handlers, and then do some type of multi-tenancy where you have different instances of OpenAuth, for example, that you want to configure separately. Based on different paths or something else like that. That means that you have to have different instances of the options types that configure those subsystems that you have to be able to separate. And because it's all DI, you have to have a way of saying, well, I want the Open API or OpenAuth options for this instance of my subsystem versus that instance. And it can't be type-based because the DI resolution system is already done based on type. So if you say, give me the OpenAuth options, the T, it won't know which one to give you. So named options is the ability to say, well, yeah, I have an options instance called foo and one called bar and one called baz. Now that method, I'm assuming, configures all of them. So it doesn't matter what the name is, you just get all of them. The reality is the options system under the covers is always named options. If you configure one without passing a name, it gets like a default name. And that is the default instance. It's just a fixed name. It's like it's an empty string or something like that. So yeah, not a lot of folks have to use named options. Most of the sort of run-of-the-mill scenarios, you don't need it. It's only when you start doing things a little more advanced where you need to have, like I said, more than one sort of carved out space for a given set of things. Like maybe you want to run MVC twice in the system. I don't know why, but often it's when people are trying to do things like multi-tenancy.
Cool. All right. Cool. Here's a health check. I've been enjoying looking at health checks. So this is a Redis distributed cache health check. So I don't know. I've done some demos on showing health checks and lately, and I really like kind of the idea. There's some in the repo, the health checks repo. There's some samples, but I also like seeing other people in the real world writing, or outside of Microsoft writing them as well. So he's going through and implementing this Redis distributed health check. So
nice.
Yeah. All right. This is one that just is really good to know about. This is open source library guidance. So James helped put this together. This is out in the Microsoft docs. So this is just really good information to know about. I'm just trying to get the word out. So there it is.
Okay, yeah, it is good information to know about. People have asked us for strong recommendations in the past about what they should do regarding some of the guidance that may or may not have been debated in the past publicly. Strong naming, or whether to use keys, or how you do TFM multi-targeting, which TFM should you target as your base. And so James and a couple of other folks worked hard to put together this guidance, specifically for folks who are building open source libraries. Like if you're building libraries just for your own apps, then the easiest thing to do is just to target the same TFM your app does. But as soon as you want to get into any type of code sharing, where you're sharing libraries between different applications that may run on different .NETs, running Xamarin versus running on .NET Core and .NET Framework, then you really need to think about what .NET standard. Do you have to up-target to a specific TFM to get certain features sometimes? How does that affect your packages? Should I strong name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a good set of initial guidance, I think, that will hopefully put some of those questions, well, if not to rest, then at least give folks our thinking and reasoning as to why we would do that. So,
cool. All right. Here's a nice post from Neil about Angular 7 with ASP.NET Core. So one of the nice features with the SPA templates with ASP.NET Core recently is that they work with the Angular CLI. So here he shows going through and configuring using the Angular 7 CLI and updating. So he first shows just blowing out the old client app folder and doing ng new. But then later on, and talks about some of the features, support for, there's material update, there's drag and drop, there's virtual scrolling, which is cool. And then he also shows down at the end here about, upgrading as well. So if you have an existing app, there's this ng update. So it's nice to see the kind of payoff of working with the Angular CLI in the SPA templates.
Right.
Yep. All right, here is an interesting one. This is an ebook from Vincent. So this is a 64-page ebook, and this is on Dockerizing ASP.NET Core and Blazor apps on a Mac. So I've seen, there's some ebooks out there and things on ASP.NET Core. This one's interesting to also look at Blazor as well. So 64 pages in here. There's quite a bit of info. So here, way down towards the end, he's got some information on here. It goes through and builds out Blazor. Yeah, Blazor application here.
Very cool.
Yeah. This one is command and mediator pattern. So this is, I don't want to say your name wrong. I think it's Karam. So talking about the command pattern, why you would use it, and using mediator to implement it. So he goes into two examples, and this is working with user registration. So the scenario of a user registers, and then we do several things. We send out, we store the person, but we also send out maybe an email message, SMS. We log things. So there's a simple, or it shows getting it set up, and he shows a simple pattern of just registering the person, And then the second example kind of pulls all this stuff in together all at once. So showing register a user and then do all the things. So yeah, kind of interesting there.
Cool.
This one is from Dave Glick. So Dave is digging into, this is a long post where he shows all these internals, and then at the end, spoiler alert, at the end he says, hey, there's libraries that will do this for you. But it's still very interesting to see exactly what's going on here. So he's talking about actually like, rendering Razor on your own. So in your application, generating code using Razor. So yeah, so all the stuff as far as hosting, compiling, loading the assembly, etc. So this is pretty cool if you want to use Razor on your own outside of ASP.NET Core. And then stay away from the silly ads. So he does down at the very end talk about Gazerator and Razor Lite. So those are two kind of libraries if you want to do this on your own.
Cool.
Or if you want to do this without writing all the code. Here we've got, this is just a neat one here. This is from Bjarte, and he went in, he had to support an existing API that's written with PHP. And so he's just showing that, by using attribute routing on a controller, very easy to maintain those existing routes. So I just thought that was cool. Shane, so I have this this extension that puts my tabs to sleep if they're idle for too long. So that's what's going on there. So Shane went through, and Shane, by the way, on the chat, which was cool to see. So here CosmosDB has support for MongoDB as well, like the same protocol or whatever. Same syntax. And so here he's showing using MongoDB locally and CosmosDB in production. And so he shows how to set that up using Docker. So this is a race tracking app. I love the names of his races, by the way. Things like team-oriented high-level access race sounds like one to get into. So then he goes through and shows this, the different Docker files pointing at setting it up for running Mongo locally. And I just like seeing some interesting things in here. Like, for instance, your user secrets are, off in your root Microsoft user secrets, etc. So pulling those in. So anyhow, going through and showing that. So this is set up to run MongoDB locally and Cosmos in production.
Cool.
Another Razor one here. This is including static resources in a Razor class library. Ooh. So Razor class library, something that you can, the default template makes it easy to pull in a Razor view. So then he's showing also pulling in static resources as well.
There's quite a bit involved in making that work well. Because obviously just getting them into the library is one step. Having them then be served as part of referencing that library and playing well with the existing static file middleware or whatever you already have configured in your application is the other part of that. Now we did this for the default identity UI that we added in 2.1.
Oh, right, yeah.
But we didn't first class it to the point that we kind of built an end-to-end for anyone trying to do that very simply. It is something that's on our plans as part of Razor Components in 3.0, and there is something already in the Blazor stuff today that does something. It's a little hacky, and we need to come up with a better way of making it smoother. But it's not straightforward. You very quickly, if you think of how web forms did this and System Web did this, that's part of the reason the script manager was born, and we have the webresource.axt and scriptresource.axt built-in handlers that would take care of serving static assets that were embedded into DLLs. But that doesn't play well with standard client-side asset management like bundling and CDN management and all that type of stuff, because now they're opaque. And so trying to find a good balance between I have this component, I just want to put it on my page, and I don't want to have to worry about anything it needs, it just works. And I have a component, I want it to look good, but I also want the ability to take its assets and optimize them, or replace some of its assets, or have some control over where the assets get placed in my project or how they're served from my application. Like those two things are pretty much completely at odds. And so we're trying to find that right balance between you drop a component in and it just works, and I can, as the consumer of a component, I can also have some control over its static assets if I need to further optimize them or whatnot. So,
cool. Yeah, and I can see here he's taken a look at the identity UI source. So exactly like you're saying there. So cool. So this is neat. This is Blazor Tetris, and so it's Bletris.
I may or may not have played quite a lot of that.
Yep. So you can watch me. I'm going to play it live on this show here. So this is neat, and here, the source code out here as well, along with a lot of others here. He's got several listed. So neat to see if you want to dig in.
Nice.
This is fun. Obviously something like writing a game is a thing where having the kind of client side UI and state and all is something that would be harder to do.
Right.
Otherwise. All right, Damien Bowden. So here, this is he's been doing some things on identity recently and integrating with identity server on the back end and stuff. So here he's looking at custom claims. So claims, of course, much more. This is the kind of advanced next step beyond like just users logging in and simple roles and stuff. This is being able to have multiple claims associated with the user. So here he's got the policy for an admin, setting that up and associating it, and then the end result here is being able to log in and being able to associate people with an administrator. So, anyways. Neat stuff there.
Cool.
Okay, Hisham. So when I read this, I started thinking, where have I seen Morris.js before with an ASP.NET? And it was actually him. So Hisham first had done a chart control with a tag helper in Morris.js. And so then he's taken this now and extended this to working with Blazor. So this is a Blazor component with Morris.js, which is a charting library. And he's talking about how he's really happy to work with a component model, and how that is a lot simpler to implement. So here he's got a Blazor chart component, and he's using JS interop to call into the JavaScript library calls, and then the end result is a beautiful chart here, and as well as this markup is pretty lightweight. So
very cool.
That is very cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the components people build out for these. All right, almost done here. I've got two things that I saw David Fowler tweet recently. So one is interesting. This is guidance on writing scalable services in ASP.NET Core.
Yep.
Yeah, so the first page, it looks like very short, and then you dig in, and there is a ton of information in here. Fun reading, explaining, and this is work in progress. They're building it out.
To be clear, the intent here is that this will end up being a doc, and this is kind of him starting to sort of brain dump a whole bunch of things that we've seen. This isn't just based on opinion. This is stuff that we've literally seen in customers' apps that cause issues. And some of this is related to the talk he and I gave at Industry London last year about diagnosability in ASP.NET Core applications. And so this and the other goal here is that every one of these code samples, we want to have an actual functional sample that you can run and see this problem reproduce when under the right conditions. And so, all right, and so a lot of these times this just looks like, oh yeah, don't do this thing, do this thing, but it can be kind of difficult to understand why. So I think the first part of this document is very much just like don't do this pattern, do this, and here's why. And then the second part is a lot of, well, help me understand why this is bad. Let's do something more real world. And then they try and show some more examples, say in a controller, calling a library that you perhaps don't own, and then inside that library they might be doing one of these things, and then how does that affect your application? Well, a lot of folks are like, well, I do some of these things and it's fine. And the reality is that, yeah, it might be fine. These are things that can lead to problems in your application. If they exist in your app, you, of course, might be fine until a certain point of load, generally. And it's all to do with how your application can deal with bursts of load, or even sustained load that gets to once it gets to a certain threshold. in some cases, if you have some of these patterns in your application, you'll be able to handle a burst because the burst goes away and then the runtime and the thread pool is able to recover because the load disappears and the backlog of work that is often built up can be cleared out. If that load gets over a certain threshold though and then maintains that level, the app will never recover. It becomes a degenerative scenario. You basically get the app into a downward spiral and it will never, ever, ever recover because there simply aren't enough resources available to service the work items that these patterns have forced your application to do. And so, yeah, it is true. You might look at these and go, well, I do these things and my app is fine. And it might be because you only ever get 4 requests per second on your application and you've never had to deal with anything higher than that. But literally, some of these patterns, you could be perfectly fine at 8 requests per second. And then when you get to 9, if it stays at 9, the app will never recover.
Wow.
And so we have demos that showed this on stage at NDC London, and one of the goals of this is to have apps that you can run with inside a harness or with a sidecar tool that you can like adjust the load and you can see it fail. So you can say, oh, it looks to be running fine when I give it 20 requests per second, but as soon as I try and make it go up to 25, it doesn't ever recover. Even if I pull it back from 25, 30 seconds later, the app just cannot recover because there's too much work backed up. And so I think having these type of examples will help people understand why these issues can come around and why they're so important to try and avoid them. Obviously, a doc is a great first step. We'd love to get to the point, and that's part of our plans for 3.0, is to try and make it so it's very difficult to get into the situation in the first place because the tools and the language and just the runtime warn you against these things and make it very hard for you to actually put these things in your app in the first place. But first step is good docs.
Cool. All right, one more from David, and this is just, I thought this was interesting, feature gaps on replacing web host builder with host builder. I don't know if you want to talk any about this or if this is even too early to start talking about. But
no, this is perfectly fine. I mean, this is a good segue, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, the last link I had was your
was the blog post. Yeah,
blog post. So
that's 3.0 stuff. That's good. Yeah, no. So that the first one there, David's post is about we have the web host type today. In every ASP.NET Core application, there's a program main in which there's a couple of lines of code that boot the ASP.NET Core host off a type called web host. And that returns an iWeb host builder that you then call build on, and that gives you an instance of iWeb host that you call start or run on. ASP.NET is one of the things about ASP.NET Core that's very different from the past. ASP.NET is that it's a sort of a managed hosting model. It's in-app hosting. So your application is a console app. It's all it is. Like you run it the command line and it starts up like any other console application. It's not a special host booting the CLR like we had in IIS that you need a different server or a different thing to actually host your application like IIS. It's a console app. Right. So the web host is the thing that lets you start that host up, and you can have more than one in your application if you like. The problem with the web host is that it's tied to web applications, and by web I mean ones that serve HTTP. But as we know, in the world of server programming, there are lots of other protocols, there are lots of other things that you might want to run on a quote-unquote server. They may not even accept requests. They might be things that dequeue jobs from a background service or from a message bus, or just do batch, wake up every 5 minutes and do a batch processing. And those are still server applications in the sense that they're not running on your desktop or somewhere. They run as part of your larger server infrastructure. And all the things that we built for ASP.NET Core, dependency injection and logging and configuration and this hosting model, the composition of middleware, modulo whatever your pipeline is. You may not have an HTTP pipeline, you might have a queue processing pipeline or a TCP pipeline, but you have the concept of code that runs on events that happen over the lifetime. Those concepts are applicable to all those application model types. And so the concept of a generic host as opposed to a web-specific host took hold around the 2.0 timeframe. I think we actually shipped the type in 2.1. But the problem with that, and it lets you, do all the things I talked about. You can use all those Microsoft.extensions.x subsystems and get the same benefits. You can use the same logging, the same configuration, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't put a server in a generic host easily because, for example, all the extension methods and types that we built to let you boot those up rely on the web host type, iWeb host, not the new iHost type. And so we need to rationalize that as part of 3.0. And the plan is to effectively deprecate the web host boot up. The current plan is that it would still be in 3.0. There's no point removing it. It's just another hurdle for people moving their applications to 3.0. But the new applications would all be booted up, whether they're web applications or different server applications, would all be booted up through this generic host. And so there's a fair bit of work involved to obviously duplicate all the extension points that we have on web hosts and the things that hook those extension points onto generic host. And there's also all the startup patterns, like the startup class is a unique feature of the web host currently. And we have to decide whether that is even needed in the generic host land. There are some quirks of the current web host, like there's this two-phase boot up stage, which some folks may have run into, where there's a DI container built for the hosting, the startup phase, and then we add your services and kind of create a different container and spill in the first container into the second one, and then we boot that one up. And that can lead to some weird lifecycle problems, like I can't do logging with my configured providers early in the boot up of the application because we haven't booted your container yet, which is where all the logging providers are. And so if we have this, as part of this rationalization, we'd like to smooth all those little rough edges out and just revisit some of those premises. And yes, we may end up removing some patterns. Someone commented yesterday, there are some fairly lesser used patterns that we did add to the web host that aren't particularly well documented and not used, like you can have the configure services method and the configure method on your startup class. They're not typed, like you don't implement an interface to get those, they're all pattern matching based. And you can have configure environment name services, and we'll find that and call that if the current environment name matches that one. But we don't see that used a lot. It's not in the templates. I've never shown it in a demo. I don't think anyone's ever shown it in a demo from the team. But it was there because we thought, during beta 4 or something in the original release, we thought that might be an interesting pattern. So some of those things that we've not, that aren't particularly used and may not carry over into the new thing, you might see those fall away in the new generic host stuff. But like I said, the current plan is for the web host probably to stick around for 3.0 at least, for that major cycle, just to ease with people moving from 2x to 3.0. So that was that item. That was Fowler's item. The other one obviously was the post I put up yesterday announcing some of the sort of the first announcements around ASP.NET Core 3 and some of the changes that will happen. And these are sort of foundational. This is not a feature post. I'm going to do a feature post later, probably next week or so, and I can talk about feature plans today. It's kind of what I hope to do as a precursor to the next post. This post was about heads up for some sort of major platform level changes. Then some of these are breaking changes, and so we wanted to give folks a very early look at some of these changes before we've even finished 2.2. Like 2.2 will ship later on in the year. We've done the final preview, that was preview 3. We haven't shipped the first preview of 3.0 yet. So now is a good time to make some of these announcements. So the first one was around packages versus frameworks. And there's a bit of history there about how ASP.NET Core was originally conceived 5 years ago or more as a bunch of packages, and NuGet would be the center of the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We ran into a whole bunch of problems or issues with that and trade-offs that were very difficult to make. And so in ASP.NET Core 3, we're landing in a place where a lot of stuff will still say as packages, especially things that are sort of more BCL-y. So like everything Microsoft.extensions.star, which is that weirdly named set of packages that we created to create sort of more modern application-focused APIs for logging and config and those type of things, rather than the more static type of APIs that we had in .NET Framework before. They will remain as packages, and you can use those. Entity Framework will continue to use those. Entity Framework Core, I should say. The Signaler client uses those. So things that use those that run on more than one .NET, basically. They will all be Microsoft extensions still. They'll all be packages. Entity Framework Core will move out of the shared framework. And just be available as packages. It's always been available as packages, but it was also included in the ASP.NET Core.all and ASP.NET Core.app shared frameworks. That won't continue, and you'll just need to add the package ref for Entity Framework Core. It just means it's like every other data access library, okay? And it's simpler in the sense that Entity Framework Core, one of its key benefits is that it runs kind of everywhere. It runs on every .NET, which the previous Entity Framework didn't. And so in order to facilitate that, it has to run as packages. That's kind of the only way to do that. And then lastly, the big part of this obviously is that ASP.NET Core 3 will effectively just be part of .NET Core 3. So we shipped it as a shared framework in 2.1, which was the default experience, but we also had packages that were .NET standard based, which means that you could run them in .NET Framework, because ASP.NET Core 1 and 2 support running on .NET Framework. That causes a little confusion. We do continue to get that feedback of like, oh wait, ASP.NET Core can run on .NET Framework? I thought ASP.NET Core was .NET Core. But for a bunch of customers, that was a key bridge that allowed them to use ASP.NET Core while still running on .NET Framework in order to use APIs that we hadn't yet made available on .NET Core. With the advent of .NET Standard 2, with the advent of the .NET Framework consumption ability of being able to take any .NET Framework library and try and use it in .NET Core since .NET Core 2, and the Windows Compatibility Pack, plus in .NET Core 3, because we're bringing WPF and WinForms onto .NET Core 3, there are more .NET Framework APIs and features coming back, like COM+ activation and other things that are required by WinForms and WPF. Now it looks like a good time for us to make that jump to ASP.NET Core 3 being exclusively a .NET Core 3 and above thing. It also means that ASP.NET Core can much better start utilizing all of the features that are only going into .NET Core. Now, we started this again in 2.1 with Span, and frankly, it was a lot of work. It's actually quite a lot of work to support ASP.NET Core running on new APIs that are .NET Core specific, while also sort of maintaining the backwards compatibility to .NETs that won't support those APIs or can't for whatever reason. And so, as I said, this transition allows ASP.NET Core 3 to really fully leverage and utilize all these great enhancements that are coming to .NET Core. And in a lot of cases, ASP.NET Core's workloads and features are driving the addition of those APIs. Things like Span first shipped in some form in ASP.NET, in Kestrel, in ASP.NET Core 3 as private code, reaching into the core CLR in 2.1 to light up those features, or in 2.0 I should say, and then we made them available to everyone after they got bake time just with ASP.NET Core 3. And so that pattern, having ASP.NET Core and .NET Core sort of be symbiotic and just revving together, just allows us to move that much quicker and sort of innovate in a better way. So that's the first part of that announcement, I think, or the first and second parts. I may have put two together. The third part was about, while we're also, the other part was that the shared frameworks as they are, those core platform pieces, those are the things you have to install on a machine, like a runtime before you can run the application. To date, we had included some third-party components in there, like things that we don't compile, things that we don't have the capability of servicing because we don't own the NuGet packages, and that does cause some issues. There's a couple of issues that causes. One is, well, we can't service them, and so if something goes critically wrong, we have to work, basically go hat in hand to some other party and say, can you really, really please fix this issue? Because we physically are incapable of fixing it, like because of the way .NET identity works and the way NuGet identity works, we don't even have a technical mechanism for shipping changes to those without breaking everyone else's code, unless the original component author does it. And so we're removing that problem and saying, no, this very core part of the platform, this shared framework part, is always guaranteed to be something that we can service. The second part is around, well, obviously, doing that, it doesn't mean that we don't love open source and we don't want to integrate with open source. Of course we do. And so the third announcement there is that for some of the more modern workloads, we have to, it's more of an open recognition and embracing of the fact that we have to really use third-party components, or it's certainly a good approach to use and better integrate with some of these third-party open source components to deliver a great end-to-end out of the box. So, file new, I get an ASP.NET Core thing, I go to the documentation, I learn how to do API authorization in my MVC application. How does that work? Well, there's a whole bunch of components you need to do standards-based API authorization, and why should we go and build those again when there's already perfectly reasonable solutions and popular, not just reasonable, but popular and very well supported solutions in the community. And so that's one of the things they point out there, things like Identity Server that we've done some work to better integrate with as part of the 2.2 wave. We saw things like the poly support that we added in 2.1, and so we added HTTP Client Factory. We didn't add all the retry policies and things that the Client Factory was designed to sort of allow you to do. We simply said, use poly, and we worked with the poly authors to make sure that it worked well with the Client Factory. And we have docs that talk about how to do that. And as the post talks about, that type of support or integration will take different forms. Sometimes it'll involve our engineers writing code and sending PRs to other people's repos, which I think we'll start to see a lot more of. Sometimes it'll involve us having our default templates include package references to these third-party components. Sometimes,
yeah, that was my next question, was how that works, right?
Yeah, and so these are, and that does present some problems, some issues, I should say, that we have to work through. Because once they're in the default experiences, there's expectations around from our customers as to support and longevity and all those type of things. Now, the .NET Foundation can help for a lot of those things because the .NET Foundation includes policies for, what's the term, for like
survivability.
Survivability,
right?
Thank you. So for if a open source library owner decides they don't want to own the library anymore, or God forbid something terrible happens to them, then there needs to be a continuity plan in place that can transition the ownership to someone else, sort of under your consistent guidance and policy and all the rest of it. Then also things like security updates. We want to be able to work closely with library authors when vulnerabilities are discovered and go through a good process for disclosing those vulnerabilities, getting them fixed, and then shipping them to customers in a similar fashion that we do to our own things, where we have a regular cycle and we have a bug bounty and all those type of things. So we're investigating and looking at sort of policies and procedures to put in place to do those things. And in my view of this is that Microsoft obviously wields a lot of leverage and, we want to have a better word, power in this community, and we want to try and use that to help our customers embrace open source. So I think we've gone through phase one, I like to say, of the Microsoft or ASP.NET and .NET open source journey. We open sourced our own frameworks. We take PRs from the community. We have open issues that people can comment on, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the next phase is that, great, how do we use that phase to then set up the next phase, which is, well, how do we make it so that it's more common for our customers to not question the use of open source, even if it doesn't come from Microsoft, which we have seen in other communities, whether it's the Java community or the Node community, for example. And it doesn't come without its issues. Like, no one's saying it's a panacea and that you should just use open source and it's fine. No, there are real considerations, whether they're legal or longevity or supportability or end of life and LTS and all these type of things. Different customers and different applications have different needs and requirements. But who better to try and help move that needle, so to say, than us? And so we're going to try, and this is something that we're looking to do. And when, frankly, as I said, we want to deliver great solutions to our customers, saying we can build ASP.NET Core or .NET Core applications that serve these application workload types, whether it be microservices or whatever it might be. And we can't afford to build all of those workloads ourselves. We're not the biggest team in the world. And there's already fantastic solutions to a lot of those things. It's just that sometimes those things need a little bit of support. And so who better to offer that support in the right case than us, right? And so that's kind of how we look at bootstrapping this. Now, in other communities, there's often been a phase beyond that, where not only the incumbent sort of power or company behind the original platform starts offering that support, but the community themselves start rallying around particular things and building their own support mechanisms, whether it's through a foundation like the .NET Foundation, or whether it's through a completely new entity that they create because you get enough large or interested parties together to say, you know what, the 6 of us all share common needs when it comes to this set of open source code or libraries. And we want to ensure longevity, and we want to ensure that there's a good process for doing security fixes, and we want to ensure there's a good policy for support so that people can call someone and get a bug fix, for example. And so they form groups. So, for example, the Node LTS is an example of that. Node LTS wasn't put together by and managed by the same people who build Node.exe. It was put together by a different group. They work very closely, obviously, and they have a nice continuous cycle and a very predictable cycle of when Node, current versus Node LTS moves. But the policies are very straightforward, they're very predictable, but the key point is that Node LTS is effectively managed by a different group than the Node sort of current release. And that's an example in my mind of of a third phase, beyond the phase that I like to think that we're entering now, this second phase where we try and really integrate more open source and figure out ways to help that open source that we're integrating with into our default experiences. So I hope some of those things resonate. I understand that some of those things might, some people might have some feedback and some issues with some of those things. But those are the first set of announcements that went out yesterday, and I'm happy to answer questions about them, or I can talk about some stuff coming up in .NET Core 3. Although we only have about 10 minutes left, so.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't seen a whole. I guess I'll stop sharing my screen here. I haven't seen a bunch of questions. I think hopefully that means that's because you're describing things so well.
I've seen a bunch of feature questions. I've seen a bunch of people asking they would like to hear more about stuff coming in 3.0. Razor components, as Shamko is asking about. Some people have some questions as they relate to if ASP.NET Core 3 is only going to run on .NET Core 3, what does that mean for some of the components that we might use on other platforms today? As I already stated, Microsoft.extensions will continue to target Net Standard in 3.0, and thus you'll be able to use them on all the .NETs because those libraries are very sort of BCL-ish, and a lot of people like to take just the bits they like and use them. I think Orleans uses a bunch of that stuff. The Azure Functions infrastructure is built on the generic host and a lot of that same infrastructure, and so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so there's a question here. Let me have a look. Or I can just go to, so someone's asked, when is in-process .NET Core in IIS official? That's Dane Watson. That's in 2.2. So 2.2 Preview 3 has the default experience in Visual Studio 2018, was it 2017, 15.9, Preview 4, is that new 2.2 applications run on IIS Express in process, and thus when you deploy, they'll run in IIS in process. So that's part of the 2.2 release, the in-process stuff. The JSON stuff. Oh, the other thing that was announced, I didn't mention talking about the blog post, was there was an announcement about the future of JSON in .NET Core 3, and so a very similar thing. JSON.NET's been around for a very long time, and obviously has served the .NET community very well. But there is a desire now to a couple of things. One, the core of .NET should have fantastic JSON APIs of some sort, and it just doesn't today. We just don't have, JSON is ubiquitous, it's used everywhere, and .NET does not have JSON in its core. Today, most people use JSON.NET. As a result of that, ASP.NET Core today as a shared framework actually uses JSON.NET. It takes a dependency on JSON.NET. So if you use ASP.NET Core, you have to use JSON.NET. You can't really avoid it. It's in your graph either way, right? Even if you don't call any of the APIs that use JSON.NET and you replace the JSON format or do something else, JSON.NET is in your graph. So if you do want to use JSON.NET for something, you have to at least use the version that we stipulate. Because if you use a version lower than that, you're likely going to break us. And that does cause problems for customers. We had that feedback very quickly after we made that change in 2.0, I think it was, where, for example, the test host, it was very difficult to test code when both the host that is running the tests and the code itself and the framework all want to use JSON.NET, but they don't agree on the version because of the way .NET works. Isolating assembly loading and unloading is a very difficult problem. And that's also, incidentally, something that we're trying to solve in .NET Core 3 by introducing a new application model API that allows you to load assemblies into an individual context and then use them in that context and then throw them away again. So that is one of the things that having JSON.NET baked in effectively to the framework causes a problem with. Just because we're adding JSON APIs, sort of low-level, fast, span-based JSON APIs in .NET Core 3, doesn't mean you can't use JSON.NET, doesn't mean we won't ship JSON.NET integration packages. We will. There will still be a JSON.NET-based MVC JSON formatter, for example, and it's just that will be in a package, and you can add it, and then you can just use it. But the default JSON formatter that is based in the framework itself will use the lower-level, simpler APIs. And so, yeah, you don't really lose anything. You only gain something. So, okay. Let's just have a quick scan here.
A question about ASP.NET Core webhooks.
Yeah, so ASP.NET Core webhooks, I mean, the truth is we did an effort at one point to try and port that. That was done in support of the Azure Functions team because the original version of Azure Functions used the webhooks infrastructure to sort of enable all their webhooky type stuff. With the new Azure Functions v2, which is built in .NET Core, they don't use it anymore. And so that effort was stopped. And the reality is that we just don't have enough people using webhooks, the original version of webhooks, to really warrant the investment required to port that over on the team. Like we looked at usage numbers, we looked at downloads, we looked at the number of people asking as a concrete ask or citing that as a blocking reason why they couldn't move. And it was just frankly too low compared to all the other things that are important. And so it is somewhat zero-sum. We can't do everything. We understand that some folks like the webhooks API and they use it. It was never actually built by the ASP.NET team. It was built by a different group and then kind of donated to the ASP.NET team. And so it just hasn't made it to the top of the list. It is a candidate for I would offer it is probably a good candidate for someone or a group of people from the community to just do a straight port over. So not try and rewrite it or anything, but just try and get it working on top of the newer primitives and the newer patterns in ASP.NET Core MVC. But it's just not something that's bubbled to the top of our priority list.
Question on, will the JSON library be Net Standard or Net Core App?
So the JSON library as it's currently announced will be in .NET Core 3. The way that the .NET Standard rationalization sort of process works is that they're very hesitant to just introduce new APIs in a new version of .NET Standard and then tell everyone they have to implement them. The general approach is that a framework will introduce a new API and release it first, and then once it's established itself and been baked, it'll go through the process of being included into a future version of .NET Standard. For example, like Span, which is now being considered in the next version of .NET Standard. And so I'm not saying it's not going to be in .NET Standard, but it will not be in the next version, if that makes sense.
Cool. Let me see. Anyone know if EF6.NET Core port will work on Linux or be like WPF and WinForms?
It'll work on Linux as well. So the EF6 port to work on .NET Core will work on both. It's one of the sort of modular parts of the bringing WinForms and WPF to .NET Core. That's all Windows only, obviously. But as part of bringing that over, EF6 will come over because so many applications sort of require the EF6 model for their desktop apps. But that code has no intrinsic tie to Windows, so that code will just run and be supported on all the platforms.
Well, one thing that jumped out to me, there's the thing about the shared framework and using the references to the shared framework versus packages, and I think it was also discussed in the issue about discontinuing some of the NuGet packages. Is the reason just to cut down on the overhead of producing those packages, or we think people aren't going to be using those packages independently?
It's a little bit of those two, not as much as those two, as it reduces confusion around project composition. And so one of the biggest problems we had today in NetCore 2.1 apps, and there are issues you can find where you can see on the GitHub where there's long discussions about this, is that to use the shared framework, to use the ASP.NET Core.app shared framework, you have to have a package reference today. Now, a package reference in your project, right? And that's the default experience today. The package reference comes with all these connotations. You assume it's going to behave a particular way. Now, NuGet packages, when you reference them, typically end up putting DLLs in your application output, right? That's how a NuGet package works. It delivers the DLL to you, and then you take that DLL with you when you publish the application. You also specify a version, and that version of the package gets reasoned about with any other instance of that package that appears in your graph, because remember, we have transitive references, so not all your packages in the graph are listed. Sometimes you reference something else that then references the same thing, but it references a different version. And that conflict resolution is managed by NuGet, and there are rules that determine, well, which version am I going to use? Because I can only have one in my graph. I can't have two versions of the same library in my graph at the same time. And that can get very confusing when, say, I reference your library, John, and you want JSON.NET 10, but in my application, I have already put JSON.NET at version 9 in my project file. So in my project file, I see John's great library and I see JSON.NET, right? And I have version 1 of your library and version 9 of JSON.NET. But your library says it wants JSON.NET 10. Which version of JSON.NET actually gets loaded?
Right.
Do you know? That's a pop quiz.
Yeah. Hoisting, right? Is it going to take the newest?
So that is the natural answer, is you would think it would take the newest, but the answer is it depends. In this case, it won't. It'll take the lowest because of a rule called nearest wins, which is you have an explicit reference to JSON.NET in your project, which is closer than the reference to JSON.NET that is transitively brought in by the fact that I'm referencing your library. And so yours acts as an override, as in the one in the project. Problem is that will usually break your library because you were expecting version 10, which probably means that you're using some version 10 thing. And when does that error turn up? It turns up when you run the application and your library, when I call into it, tries to use some JSON.NET 10 feature and you get a type load exception or a member missing exception, like the worst possible things. And then you're in DLL hell because you have no idea why. Why is the DLL? The compiler worked. Why is it that it can't find the method at runtime? That's why. And so that's the bigger problem, is that we want to ensure that if you're going to reference a framework, that is, by definition, something that has to be there on the other side for my application to run. My app runs on a framework. The framework calls into me. A library I call into, so it's expected that I bring the library with me. That's generally the definition of those terms that we use, okay? And so a shared framework in the .NET Core world, you target a shared framework on top of the TFM that you target, which is confusingly called a target framework moniker, because it is also a framework. I target this sort of extra shared framework, but I do it via a package reference, I'm sort of crossing the streams. I'm crossing the worlds, and it becomes very difficult to reason about what assembly will be used, what do I need on the machine for that application to run, what are the ways that it can fail. And then when you add things like patching and servicing roll forward policy, where I might target shared framework version 2.1.0, but if I run on a machine that has 2.1.3, I'm going to run on 2.1.3. That's how you get automatic updates when you're running on a shared framework, okay? Otherwise, you'd have to rebuild and republish your application every time we do a security release. And so those confusions have led us to say, you know what? If it's not a package, if it's actually a shared framework, you need a different reference type. And so in 3.0, we'll introduce a different reference type in your project. It'll say framework reference instead of package reference, and that has different rules. You can't put a version on a framework reference. The version of that is controlled by the TFM, which already has a version in it, and there's a whole a series of rules about what version is used at build time versus runtime and all those sort of policies that are in place. Yeah.
So devil's advocate here. I mean, we started with...
We don't need any advocate for the devil. It's fine.
Okay. Interesting question here. So we had .NET Framework, which was this big monolithic install, one install. Then with .NET Core, it was, hooray, we're going to have all these like a la carte style individual, like I can tailor my application, pull in which ones. And then we got meta packages, which kind of say like, hey, let's make it simple and pull in most of the ones you'll probably use and tooling lights up and all that. But I could go through and kind of tailor all my NuGet packages if I want them. And now with this, it feels kind of like we're moving more full circle to monolithic install. And do I lose anything here as a developer?
So I think it's fair to say things change and we listen to feedback. And so we tried, we certainly set out with a particular premise in the beginning, 5-6 years ago. And then as we saw those things used by customers, we saw where those paradigms sort of had edges or broke down completely. And for example, the proliferation of packages when you build a new framework and we layered it the way that we did, for very good reasons, but you literally end up with hundreds of packages. A lot of the problem customers faced was like, I don't even know. I know what API I want. I don't even know what package it's in. And we tried to solve some of those things with
tooling. We had that reverse lookup thing.
We had the reverse lookup thing, and it just wasn't reliable enough. And so then the other problem with delivering DLLs inside your application is serviceability. How do you get security updates to things if they're inside the application? The shorter answer is you typically don't. 2, how do you...
Version conflict thing.
Version conflict thing that we talked about. And it's more about how do you reason about that? Like, who wins? Like, your natural answer isn't your natural inclination isn't the right answer a lot of the time, and that's just too confusing. Thirdly, how do you optimize those? Do you want to optimize the application to start up faster? Probably. People like their apps to start up faster, especially when they're doing development because they're making changes and rebooting the app constantly. If you're always using NuGet packages which contain raw IL, generally, because that means they run everywhere, on every bitness, on every platform, then that IL has to be jittered every time you start the application. There's no cache for that. And so that is a cost. And so whereas frameworks can be cross-genned, they can be pre-jittered because you install them on the machine for the particular machine. And that's a fairly well understood technology. We understand its drawbacks, we understand its benefits, and we understand how to circumvent some of its drawbacks with things like tier compilation that we're introducing as well in .NET Core that you can enable that helps get back some of the steady state performance, or what we just call throughput, after the cross-gen can take away. Because cross-gen is optimized, pre-jitting is optimized for speeding up the startup code, but it can't make certain optimizations that can benefit how fast your app runs at runtime. But tier compilation can do that when it sees that those code paths are called while the app is running, and it can recompile those methods and those members after the application is running to get all that performance back. And so our understanding of what the right trade-offs of evolves as customers use the technology and we see the feedback, we see the problems that customers run into. And so all the things that you mentioned were steps that we took when we adjusted those trade-offs. We were like, well, we thought that full modularity and pay-as-you-go was the right trade-off to make. It turns out that the vast majority of customers just found it too difficult to figure out where those things were, and having a meta package that brought in all the APIs was a much better experience because then I just have all the APIs available to me. The problem with that, or the trade-off, was that, well, if it's a meta package, now I'm deploying 200 assemblies into my bin folder. That's not good because now I lose all my pay-per-play. So what if we took that meta package and turned it into a thing called a shared framework, and we required that to be on the target machine? Now my application is vastly smaller. It's just my application DLL and static resources, which is why in 2.1 and 2.0 we had this thing called the runtime store that only lived for one version. Got much smaller. So my 2.1 applications are much smaller to deploy than my 1x applications, and I get that servicing capability as well, so that when a new version comes out, 2.1.5, I install that version of the shared framework, which now includes ASP.NET Core bits, and all my applications, as soon as they restart, I don't have to recompile them, I don't have to republish them, get those bug fixes, okay? Which is why the servicing bar is so high, because we want to ensure that you don't break people. But because it's .NET Core, you also get side-by-side. So if for some reason you really do need to stick on a particular version, you can. You have that option, whereas you don't have that option with .NET Framework. You can do a self-contained deployment, which means everything does come with your application. And we have emerging technologies like the IL linker or the module linker that enables you to say, well, I reference the framework, but I don't need it all, right? I don't actually need it all to run my application, so please trim out everything or link away everything I don't use. That technology is something we're looking to bring into 3.0 and beyond, so that you really can, at customer choice, at the application level, choose what is the best set of trade-offs for this application. The reality was the way that we architected it in the beginning in 1.0 was a set of trade-offs that we forced on everybody, and over time what we've done is really said, no, this is what we think is the default set of trade-offs that applications should have, but we don't want to shut out the other options, so that there will be other ways of ensuring that you don't lose smaller applications or the ability to do side-by-side or anything. It's just that we'll use different technologies to do that. Using NuGet and packages to do that at the scale of hundreds and hundreds of modules that may version independently, for example, was just too much to really deal with.
Okay. All right.
It is 11:07, so I think we are exactly an hour in now, and so it's probably a good time to call it today. Obviously, a lot more to talk about for 3.0. This was the very first announcement we had on 3.0. I'd love to, maybe next week I can do a show where we just talk about features in 3.0.
That sounds great. Yeah.
I might actually try and get the blog post ready for next week so I can talk about, sort of do the initial overview of what we call the big rocks, the big features coming in 3.0, the things that we've sort of penciled into our plan and that we're now going off starting to create work items for. So we'll do that. How about we do that next week?
Okay.
Cool. All right.
And once again, there's no dramatic zoom out.
Yeah, we still haven't solved the dramatic zoom out thing. I'm sorry. Like, we're still trying to get the audio working, as it turns.
Somebody said they thought my audio was better with the first mic, by the way.
Yeah, I think they were just wrong. I think it was Brad. Oh. He was just wrong. Someone says my volume keeps changing, and I think it might be as I move my head closer and further away from the lapel mic here, but I don't know. We'll see.
All right. I bet OBS has a dynamic compressor. A level compressor thing.
You mean that we could enable?
Yeah, like a software.
That would even it out? Yeah. I'm sure it is. If anyone has a pointer to a good OBS plugin that will help us level out the audio. I mean, we also have a whole mixing board under the table here that all the audio is going through, which I'd be surprised if it doesn't have a similar feature. But if we can fix it in software, then by all means we could try that. It's just finicky. Like, we don't spend hours and hours in here trying to tweak all this stuff. But right. I am trying to make it as good as we can for everyone, though. So. All right, we will see folks next week.
Okay, ultra fast dramatic zoom out.
And bye.